Welcome. Today, we're going to try and create a one-stop shop of evidence-based information on the use of caffeine for athletic performance. Caffeine comes with a list of benefits from increasing alertness to delaying fatigue, and there's great evidence base and a lot of research supporting these benefits. But caffeine also does come with some risks. So, Niham, do you mind starting with some background and some fun facts about caffeine?
Sure. Caffeine is a unique compound. It is a drug, basically, actually. It has no nutritive value, but it's so embedded in our food supply. It's socially accepted. It's very common in many countries to socialize with coffee, and it's also widely used amongst the majority of the adolescents. Also, coffee sits in the center of some of the countries, like imagine Italy. They don't start the day without their coffee. But looking at the perspective of athletes, it's very well known by athletes of reducing fatigue, increasing alertness. Those are basically the two benefits, but which we are going to deep dive into a little bit further about its benefits. It has been used as an ergogenic, basically work enhancing aid, performance enhancing aid for sports performance for more than a century. And I think it can compete with creatine, which is going to be our second episode. But it's one of the most studied supplement to date. You can find a lot of research on the use of caffeine, athletic performance. It has been a go-to supplement for athletes across many sporting disciplines. It's proven, it's evidence-based, and it's legal on performance-enhancing effects. And World Anti-Doping Agency, WADA, approved its use in sports in 2004. But there is a period between 1980 to 2003, which was included in the banned substances by the International Olympic Committee, IOC. And this ban was intended to exclude the intake of large amounts of caffeine. But in 2004, as I mentioned, it was removed from the list of prohibited substances and methods by WADA. And of course, there may be different counter applications, but in the context of WADA, it's a legal substance as its performance for its performance enhancing effect. And it especially lends itself to enhancing endurance performance. We see more endurance athletes using caffeine, but are they using it effectively? If they are not, if there are any athletes that are listening to us that they haven't used caffeine or they haven't observed maybe they haven't noticed the performance enhancing of caffeine, I think our conversation in this podcast are going to help them. So let's dive into how it works, why it works, Jess.
Yeah, so it's widely believed that caffeine primarily alters sporting performance through its effects on the central nervous system. It is classified as a central nervous system stimulant. And for many people, they think of it as caffeine, but if you're a chemist or just kind of a geek out on things, it's organic molecules actually called methylxanthine that causes the effects. There is some research saying there may be a couple different mechanisms of action of how caffeine actually works, but what the one that's most widely is accepted is basically that the methylxanthine acts on the adenosine receptor and prevents the effects of adenosine. And so you may be like, what in the world is adenosine? Well, in the brain, adenosine and the adenosine receptors regulate the release of neurotransmitters that play a role in sleep, arousal, cognition, memory, and learning. And throughout the day, the amount of adenosine in your body builds up. And so as your day goes on, you start to feel more tired because of adenosine working on the receptors. So when you take caffeine, caffeine actually binds to that receptor and it prevents adenosine from actually working on the receptor. So therefore you get more, you're more alert because your adenosine can't make you feel tired. And they also is some research saying that it may also indirectly affect the release of neurotransmitters. Ones that you would know that would have an effect are like epinephrine and norepinephrine. So those are the ones that kind of make you in that like a state of like adrenaline. Dopamine, the feel good receptors, serotonin, same thing. Acetylcholine to help with memory. And then there's some others, glutamate and GABA. So even before these findings and research, many athletes, I think, knew that caffeine helped them. They weren't exactly sure why, but there's reports of even in the early 1900s of athletes using caffeine to enhance their sport performance. But athletes do respond differently for ingesting caffeine, and for everybody, it may not have a positive effect. Some people are super sensitive and they get jittery. Other people can feel high and feel like amazing when they have caffeine. So I guess before we dive on or move throughout this, it's worth answering the question, should you be using caffeine as part of your fueling strategy? I kind of hope that we answer this question throughout this podcast. So, Niham, why don't you explain some of the most common benefits that athletes are kind of may use caffeine for?
Perfect. By the way, I'm one of the amateur athletes that have on and off relationship with the use of caffeine. Sometimes I feel really good, and especially, for example, when I'm swimming, caffeine really helps me. But if it's like for an exercise that I have like higher heart rate, I feel uncomfortable. So I'm
I
trying
agree.
to arrange the dose for myself for its effects. But let's not give different thoughts to the athletes because it's different for everybody.
Yes.
And some of the most common performance benefits of caffeine, which I'm sure athletes will say, ah, yes, this happens to me if they haven't noticed, if they haven't used caffeine for that purpose. But we spoke about endurance athletes, so it improves endurance performance by increasing the time to exhaustion. So it delays
Mhm.
fatigue, and then athletes can push harder and longer. And it increases power output. It's advantageous in sports where it involves explosive moments, such as sprinting, jumping, onto weightlifting. I'm sure you will say yes to this if you have also good relationship with caffeine as a weightlifter. And it can also alter the perception of effort. So exercise can feel easier. I experience this personally when I'm swimming, and this can lead athletes to sustain high workloads, intensities without experiencing the same level of discomfort. We spoke about that it's a central nervous system stimulant, and also through that perspective, it can improve cognitive function. This includes reaction time, attention, memory. So in some sports that requires this kind of coordination, this is very beneficial to that it can increase, enhance cognitive functions, particularly in mentally demanding sports. There are more benefits according to the research, but I'll maybe invite the listeners to our Instagram, social media posts, mine and Jess, where you can find more information about this performance enhancing benefit. And it's across everywhere, a lot of research, as I mentioned. And we spoke about in the first, we asked a question. Yes, I know athletes might say, I know these effects, but do you get them? To get them, you need to use it effectively. So let's dive into some foundational facts, which is required for getting the benefits of effectively using caffeine. So is it a must or is it benefits? What's needed foundationally, just?
I would, this is something I go through a lot with athletes, working on when we're looking at nutrition and performance, and caffeine always does come up in that. And I find, and it's something you have to be very honest with yourself as an athlete or working with having the athlete be honest with you. Um, is caffeine, because of its effects, can be used as a mask. So if you are not sleeping well, or sleeping enough, people will turn to caffeine and say, oh, it doesn't make me tired. Well, you're not getting the additional benefits that we're talking about. You're basically using it as a mask for
Mhm.
not sleeping well. The same thing goes for not hydrating well enough and making yourself feel fatigued, and nutrition. So a lot of the athletes I work with tend to be female athletes. And one thing I hear very, very frequently is, I skipped breakfast because I didn't have time. My lunch was just a small like salad, and then I drank my caffeine or my pre-workout before I went to practice because I was so exhausted. And so I think really, in order to get the benefits of caffeine, you have to be very honest with yourself and look at the foundations of nutrition, sleep, and hydration, and making sure you get those all on point or as optimal as possible, before you start looking at playing with caffeine and really understanding and maximizing the benefits that caffeine can have on athletic performance without those foundations being solid. You're, I feel a lot of people use caffeine as a mask. So, um, and I know this is something we've talked about with athletes, together before, and we look at this often with athletes, is the effects, the obvious reverse effects that that caffeine can have on sleep. I know we've talked about athletes, training in the afternoon and evening and using caffeine for, enhancing their performance for their training, but then you run the reverse effect of it affecting your sleep that night. So, Niham, do you mind kind of explaining of like how when you work with an athlete, how you look at caffeine and how you
Mhm.
assess sleep versus performance kind of a little bit, or dive into
Mhm.
that?
Mhm. It's one of my favorite questions. I'm sure you would be getting the same. Oh, I have a lot of sleep problems. I can't sleep. Then I ask, when do you drink your coffee? How much coffee you drink? And then the answer I get is it's self-explanatory. So it's very important to support athletes to understand these links. So that I'm really happy to explore and explain how I assess
Yeah.
its relationship on caffeine's relationship with sleep. So there are a few facts. One is the timing, of course, like what time of the day you consume your caffeine. It can be with different resources as well. And it's related to genetics of our DNA, and that's how it impacts our sleep. It's important. Using caffeine is a double-edged sword, in my opinion, because this is a public health emergency, in my opinion. Lack of sleep as a society, I think it should be added in the list of public health emergencies, in my opinion. Lack of sleep. And
Yep.
sleep is the number one recovery tool. I think if you don't sleep enough, nothing, supplements, caffeine, nothing can help you better in recovery and in your performance. So using caffeine efficiently is important because it affects your sleep. Of course, it increases your DNA and how it responds, how you respond as a person to caffeine. It's individual. Looking at the studies, 99%, almost all, is absorbed within the 45, 60 minutes after ingestion. So that's why uh, many athletes consume caffeine so that before 45, 60 minutes before the exercise. And its effect starts around 20 to 30 minutes. Caffeine has a half-life of 5 hours. It really depends on the metabolism. So we told DNA has an impact of how we metabolize caffeine in our body. So what does having a half-life of 5 hours means? So if you, for example, ingest caffeine, uh, for example, now I'm in Cyprus and it's 6 p.m. It's too late for caffeine, in my opinion. So after 6 hours, it's basically midnight when you have to be in bed. It's still in your body. So it's going to keep you awake if your body responds in that way to caffeine. So that it interacts with your sleep. So what we recommend to athletes is first observe yourself, how your body responds to caffeine, And generally speaking, generally, having coffee, caffeine, any caffeinated product, I keep saying coffee, but it's not the only resource. There are gels and effervescent tablets and pre-workouts. That's another thing which we are going to touch upon in a while. Um, Having after 2 p.m., around 2 p.m., 3 p.m., may disturb your sleep, which is going to disturb your recovery. So that's why if you don't want caffeine to stay in your body when it's time to go to bed and have a good night's sleep, you're gonna do the timing. We're gonna speak about the dose in a while. I'm gonna throw the ball to you, but just wanted to mention one other thing. Medications like birth control, oral contraceptive pills may also alter the metabolism of caffeine, and it can stay higher in higher concentrations for longer hours. I think, according to the research, females have a longer metabolism of caffeine, which I think in women, caffeine stays longer in our body, so the half-life is longer. So these kind of individual approaches are important. That's why with athletes, I really deep dive into their consumption of coffee. And some people don't like it because they like coffee and caffeinated performance enhancing product a lot. But it's important. If it's disturbing your sleep, I think you're neutralizing and maybe even make it worse for your performance. So I spoke about the metabolism, the timing, dosing. I just wanted to mention that because I started studying pharmacy and the first thing they told us, everything, I think it's from Hippocrates, everything is a poison. What makes it a drug is a dose. So
Yeah.
what's the recommended amount of caffeine, Jess?
So I think most people will find it really intriguing that the amount of caffeine that you need is probably less than the amount that you're actually consuming. I know I have a lot of athletes that are like, I had, this pre-workout, and some pre-workouts can contain, up to 200 milligrams of caffeine. They've had, coffees or energy drinks, and energy drinks are anywhere from 50 to, we have a couple here in the United States that are 300 milligrams of caffeine in one drink, and they're drinking this and thinking they're going to get the benefits. But the recommended dose is actually for performance is actually, it does take a little bit of math, but 3 to 6 milligrams per kilogram of body weight. So I'll kind of explain that to you. Take your body weight. If you aren't familiar with kilos, take your body weight in pounds, divide it by 2.2. You're going to get a number about half, and then take that number that you have in kilos and multiply it by 3. And that is about the dose I recommend people starting with. So if you weigh about 150 pounds, divide that by 2.2, you get 70 kilos. And the dosage for a 70-kilo athlete would be somewhere between 200 to 400 milligrams of caffeine. This is going to be where I would recommend starting on the lower end and see
Mhm.
how your body does. See the effects and kind of play with it from there. Too high of a caffeine we'll kind of get into can cause some reverse effects that you may not like jittery, or as Niham explained, and I experienced the same, especially with sports that require a lot of focus. It makes my heart race and I feel like a little bit on edge. So I can't do high doses of caffeine. I do notice a difference, but the amount of caffeine and sources of caffeine vary from, like I said, pre-workouts can have 200 milligrams. You can have energy drinks that have a huge wide range. Plain coffee, I think, is somewhere around like 100, give or take. You have espressos, which are 50 milligrams. You can get caffeine gels or tablets that range, usually those are on the smaller end, about 25 milligrams. Green teas and sodas range about 50 to 100 milligrams, depending on the amount you drink or the size of your serving. But it's something you do need to be aware of. It does add up because if you had caffeine in the morning and then you train in the afternoon, you do, as Niham explained, it does take time for that to get out of your system. So multiple drinks do have a cumulative effect. Um, Again, if you're a non-caffeine user, I do recommend starting low and building up so your body gets used to it. And I think this is where the phrase comes in extremely helpful, is that more is not always better. This is especially true for caffeine. You can get jittery headaches. Some people get stomach issues. So, and then if you're in like a big moment, like a big game or something like that, where you start having your adrenaline rush, your body is pouring epinephrine and norepinephrine, and your heart rate's already going up, or like, the pre-game nerves, and jitters,
Mhm.
that already, those effects can be enhanced by caffeine that has similar effects. So I find it really, really, interesting drug that on its effects based on dosage, and again on your foundations of nutrition and sleep and hydration also affect how you're going to be feeling when you use caffeine. So definitely explore it, the amount and how you use it and when you use it. So Niham, do you want to explain why some people do experience different effects with caffeine? Because I know you and I have similar effects, like we use it sometimes, but not always, because of the different effects. So do you want to kind of explain that a little bit?
Sure, voluntarily, because
Voluntarily.
I was something I looked up when I was having problems with coffee. I was like, what's going on? So this was when I wanted to research, but it was some time ago. And so there are variations in our enzymes that metabolizes caffeine in our liver. So that's very individual. As for every person has a different DNA basically. It's like a fingerprint, sorry, and that's how your body metabolizes caffeine. So there are fast, slow, and very slow metabolizers depending on this enzyme in our liver. And our liver is basically where most of whatever we ingest, also a lot of medicines are competing for that service of liver. So that's why also if you're on some medicines, which you can consult your sports pharmacist about, if you're using chronically some of the medicines, it can also have some effect on how your body metabolizes caffeine, because basically your liver works for the same medicine, metabolizes that medicine at the same time. But speaking about caffeine, depending on how the enzyme works, fast, slow, very slow metabolizers, that makes our either sensitive or basically very happy when we are ingesting coffee. Fast metabolizers have low sensitivity. They have a higher tolerance. There are people who just have an Americano and go to sleep and they have no problems with sleep.
I don't
These
know how
people
people do that.
exist. I know some of them, and they are aliens. No, I'm joking, but they are basically fast metabolizers.
Yeah.
And there are slow and very slow metabolizers. I think we are amongst them. Having high sensitivity, low tolerance, so the caffeine stays longer in the system, and even just small amounts have higher stimulating effect. It can have gastrointestinal problems, so you may have to rush to the toilet. You may feel anxious. So these genetic differences influences the degree which an athlete performance is affected by caffeine. Looking at a study, uh, for example, there was a 10-kilometer time trial for a cycling performance for cyclists in this trial, and there was a caffeine dosage between 2 to 4 milligrams per body weight, and so they looked into the genotype, basically how the genetic variations of different cyclists in this time trial study. And for example, when some of the cyclists have a genetic makeup as a slow metabolizer, they performed 13% slower when they are given a high dosage of caffeine. So it made their performance worse rather than enhancing the performance. So that's why one size doesn't fit all in caffeine as
Hmm.
well. So there are some scientific facts behind caffeine, and we receive some questions from athletes, a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Some of them, they are not aware that it's about caffeine, but we realize that sometimes it's because of the use of caffeine. So let's look at some of these questions, whether caffeine is a diuretic.
Diuretics mean it makes you go to the bathroom a little bit more, makes you pee a little bit more.
That's
And
the,
some people
that's the way.
believe, yeah, that caffeine may make you, because of it being, it is a natural diuretic. It is has a mild effect on the body that causes your body to flush out sodium and fluid. So some people believe that by drinking caffeine or caffeinated drinks, you become dehydrated.
Mhm,
Um, and most people, if you're a coffee drinker or drink any type of energy drink, you definitely notice that you really do have to use the restroom a little bit more right after drinking it, and that is because of the stimulating effects that the caffeine has. But the scientific community has suggested that it actually doesn't contribute to dehydration if you're a habitual caffeine
mhm,
user. Although the literature doesn't support the idea of caffeine-induced diuresis during exercise. So I usually tell people, I guess my usual statement to an athlete would be, um, you still have to drink water. You cannot drink caffeine all day long. You can have a cup in the morning, maybe a little before a workout, but you do have to still hydrate yourself. Hydration with water is absolutely critical, and caffeine can play a small role in making you have to go to the bathroom more, but it's not going to completely dehydrate you unless you actually only drink caffeine or caffeinated drinks all day. So I would say the jury's kind of still out. I would say it doesn't really cause dehydration, but you do have to be aware that it could cause you to use the restroom a little bit more. Um,
mhm,
one question that I know we talk about, and this is one,
mhm,
what about the thoughts of the use of caffeine in young athletes? We get that
mhm.
often.
Yes, this is important because we also talk about the social use of
Yes.
coffee. So that's why I think, I mean, youth, younger athletes, they are also involved in this socialization. So it's important to know how much they use, whether it's good for them, or what should
Hmm.
maybe parents should be aware of their supervisors about the use of caffeine. So younger athletes, youth, they are involved in sports, are more fun. So whether they need to increase their performance or not, it's questionable because when it's for fun, if it's in the spirit of sports, I believe it's not necessary because on the development phase of an athlete, they have the body functions that is already enhancing their performance. Looking at the scientific literature, if a, a parent is hearing, listening to this podcast, it's important that this consider for their own child or if they are supervising a junior athlete. So, according to the American Academy of Pediatrics, those under the age of 12 shouldn't consume caffeine at all. So this is very important. And if if an athlete is a younger athlete between 12 and 18, the limitation is 100 to 20 milligrams per day. So it's around 2.5 milligram per kilogram of body weight. So this is basically like an one shot of espresso, in my opinion, one or two shots, like one cappuccino maybe. For example, that's the amount. It has impact on sleep. If children or adolescents don't get a good night's sleep, it negatively affects their development and growth, basically their performance, which they naturally have the functions for. So avoiding caffeine is the right choice here, so they don't have any disruption on their sleep. And adolescents and children. They are smaller, they are tiny people. So caffeine may have more impact on them according to the doses that are recommended. So they may be susceptible to the negative effects of caffeine. There is one important fact. This is for athletes who are based in US. So high amounts of caffeine are banned in US NCAA. The concentration is about 400 to 500 milligram of caffeine.
That's a lot.
4 to 6. Yes, it's a lot. I think. I mean, your heart will explode. We said maybe this is like 9 milligrams, I guess, per kilogram. If I try to calculate it, do the math. So this is way beyond the recommended amount. So it's also risky, perhaps. So basically, bottom line, I think athletes that are younger should try to avoid or stay in really lower doses of caffeine as it's recommended. So another question is about whether caffeine load should be done.
Like carb loading.
Yeah, carb loading. I mean, if the athletes have listened to up until now carefully, they know the answer, but give the details, Jess.
Yeah, so obviously, caffeine loading isn't going to be like carb loading, or some people will do sodium preloading to
Mhm.
making sure that their muscles are really hydrated. If you want to maximize the benefits of caffeine, I don't really suggest ingesting high doses leading up to the day before a big race. You actually may experience negative side effects from all the caffeine consumption,
Mhm.
and actually derail your preparation and your performance. That maybe you might be like bouncing off the walls. You may not getting good night's sleep. The pre-competition jitters may be enhanced. Your mind may be racing. You may be a little more anxious. I know sometimes a lot of caffeine will make me feel a little more anxious. So I definitely don't recommend preloading or caffeine loading high doses the day before. It's actually been shown that habitual caffeine use, so day after day after day after day, consumption actually dampens its ergogenic effects. And it was really interesting. There was a study published in the early 2000s that found that non-users of caffeine actually experience greater effects that lasted longer than compared to regular users of caffeine. So those that are avid caffeine consumers might experience, you might want to try like experimenting with limiting your intakes on the days prior to races. But the jury is kind of still out whether limiting that the day before will still benefit your performance. But it's definitely plausible that those who consume caffeine um, may habitually may kind of blunt the response. Uh,
Mhm.
so it might be something I kind of tell people with anything, try it.
Mhm.
Try going a couple days without caffeine and then see if you get a better result the day you use caffeine. I would always recommend trying it before a competition,
Yeah.
like in practice. So maybe go a couple days without and then see how you do. But it's definitely something as we've talked about, it's very individual, very personal to each athlete. Some of it will just, again, depend on how your nutrition and your sleep have been. I feel like we kind of harp on that a lot, or at least I do, that you have to be able to have those ahead of time to really see the effects. So, um, kind of talking about uh, going cold turkey. What are your thoughts, or how, I guess, even some tips on kind of stopping or withdrawing caffeine for a little bit leading up to a race, and how, even thoughts on how you deal with some of the side effects of,
Mhm.
stopping caffeine for a few days. What do you think, Nilham?
Yeah. Yeah. That's why we are saying try, because there may be some negative effects of cutting it completely, the cold turkey. So if
Yeah.
you withdraw coffee with any source, not just caffeine, I keep saying caffeine and any kind of resource, uh, the idea is you explain whether you get a bigger boost or if you resume it on the race day. So, for example, there is an Ironman 7.3 half Ironman winner, Fenella Langridge. She withdrew caffeine a few days before her race, and it felt more like a stimulus on her race day. So this is just one individual. We talk about genetics and very individual approach. So it may work for some individuals, some athletes, as a more stimulating on the performance. But better to try before the practice and the practice period before the race. So you may also have maybe a headache. Some people have experienced it according to the research. So it may make you more groggy, you may feel more uncomfortable, maybe more sleepy. So it's really better to try, but there are some positive results according to some real life athletes examples. So let's give some kind of a how to use caffeine before
Yeah.
exercise or race guidance to the athletes who are listening to this. So would you like to share some
Yeah.
guidance to the athletes?
So usually my pre-caffeine kind of talk with athletes are depending on the time you train. So we're going to start with like if you're a morning training person and you have coffee, if you have your morning coffee and you train within probably 2 to 3 hours, it's that morning coffee can act as your pre-workout or your
Mhm,
pre-caffeination. If you don't train till later in the day, so I would say over 4 hours, you may need to consider using caffeine again in order to get the effects during your training. So again, it depends on your train. And at night, that is again a double-edged sword. If you have caffeine in the morning, obviously by that point, if you're training at 5 or 6 in the evening, it's out of your system. You're not going to get the benefits. But if you do decide to use caffeine or a pre-caffeine regimen before training, you run into that area that Niham talked about of if you take it late at night, it's still in your system somewhere between 5 to 10 hours later. So if you have 200 milligram caffeine 5 to 10 hours later, you're at only 100 milligrams, and that can definitely affect the quality of your sleep. And so the evening ones are again a lot of trial and looking at how are you sleeping and is it really necessary? Are you getting the benefits from your training? So, yeah, I feel like what are your thoughts on the kind of working with how to pre-caffeinate
mhm,
effectively and when to pre-caffeinate?
mhm, mhm. We talk about because caffeine is absorbed within 45 to 60 minutes. So traditionally, depending on the timing of the exercise, better to digest, an hour before, 45
Uh-huh.
minutes to an hour before to get the ergogenic effects. And in 15, 20 minutes after consumption, uh, if you're using caffeine frequently and you're a fast metabolizer, you're going to start to feel the ergogenic effect. I think if you use it up until the 30 minutes before the race or competition or the exercise, I think that's more like trying to stay in the middle and make
Yeah.
a particular recommendation 30 minutes before, an hour before, depending on how you metabolize it. You've got to observe yourself. You're going to see the benefits. Of course, in longer competitions, athletes tend to use caffeinated gels for example, if they are in the last push and they are going to see the effect. They also arrange the use of caffeinated resources as part of also race in race nutrition. So I also seen that like every 45 minutes, 60 hours, sometimes if it's an endurance sport, some athletes may use the very lower dose of caffeine, like it's around 25 milligrams or so. So it's also important to mention that you may get the effect before the race. There is a metabolism effect of how you respond to caffeine, and considering the total amount you need to get caffeine throughout the day, you can also use it during the race to increase
Yeah.
your performance. But of course, always practice this during the practice period, not in the race, because you may also respond differently. So test and trial.
I
There
agree.
is one point I would like to mention as well. You have a morning exercise, for example, and you benefit from caffeine, but some people may also get negative effects of using caffeine just within the first hour of waking up. Some scientists and research recommend not to use caffeine within the first hour of you wake up because you have higher cortisol levels
Hmm.
and the time you wake up. So if you're like if you think you start your morning well with a coffee, but then you start to feel differently, you might also take a look at not drinking your morning coffee or any caffeinated resource within the first hour of you waking up, and then arrange your exercise accordingly. There may be some negative effects. Also, drinking any caffeinated product on an empty stomach may be risky as well. So those are some
Yeah.
few cents that I wanted to include here
No,
from
I
my
think that's
perspective.
I think that's really important. I know there's been a lot of talk recently about whether starting your morning with that basically spike of cortisol and the role cortisol plays in your fight or flight, and set
Yeah.
you up for the rest of the day. I think that's a really interesting area. Maybe we'll dive into in another episode of, what is cortisol and the morning caffeine or cortisol spikes, and does caffeine play a role in that? Because I think there's a lot of research coming out in that area just because we're in such a high stress society these days.
Indeed.
So, yeah,
Let's
I
look
think
into
that's
that.
really interesting and a good point to bring up.
Good idea. Perfect.
Yeah.
So we spoke about some of the dosing within different kind of resources. So there are also energy drinks, which is perceived as a sports drink, but it's not. So let's talk about some additives in energy drinks that are outside of caffeine. Not sports drinks,
Oh,
energy drinks. What do you think?
yeah. I mean, I don't know about you, but I feel like every shelf of every store here in the United States is filled with, I don't know, 18 or 20 different types of energy drinks to
Yeah,
choose from. Times five, each of those drinks has five different flavors. So there's
yeah.
probably like 100 to 200 drinks for these kids. And if you look at the marketing, a lot of it is marketing towards kids and youth
Hmm.
athletes and younger athletes. And a lot of people don't realize that energy drinks, um, they're risky. They're not regulated, and so some may even have banned substances in them, or they're loaded with artificial stuff, I guess. Some of them are loaded with tons and tons of sugar. Others have supplements, I would call them, that may be subclinical. They're going to advertise, different ingredients in there, and try and tout why that you should purchase that one. And that doesn't always mean that it's going to be the best choice for you. So my thought on energy drinks is they're risky, especially if you don't know what's in them. Even looking at the back of the labels sometimes doesn't mean that that's exactly what's in the drinks. Looking at the sugars and artificial stuff, and then just the risk of it containing something that could be harmful, or in doses higher than you need. So I think, my personal opinion is, if you're going to stick with caffeine, stick with something that you know, whether that be a
Hmm.
pre-workout that can be tested.
Hmm.
Coffee is always a safe choice. It tends to be very safe. And matcha tea, green teas, all of that,
Hmm.
where you kind of know the dose a little bit more than some of these energy drinks. And a lot of them are loaded with caffeine, with 300 milligrams
Yeah.
in a glass and I or bottle, and a lot of the kids are drinking the whole thing. So I don't know. My verdict is I'm I'm not a big fan of energy drinks. I'm a bigger fan of controlled caffeine use. And
Hmm.
so I guess that's my thoughts on that. Do you have any on energy drinks being in Cyprus or having traveled around? the other
Um,
countries?
yeah, I mean, energy drinks are considered to be sports drinks, so that's generally the perspective amongst athletes, and of course, huge risks to younger athletes. I mean, you explained it very well. What I'm going to say is, please read the label.
Yeah.
Look at the label. Know what you're drinking. I mean, I feel scared when I'm walking towards an energy drink stand. Honestly, I feel scared. So many, for example, like I don't want to mention any brands, but some of them
Yeah.
have lots of other additives in it,
Mhm.
which can, which is beyond caffeine. So just my last message on this topic is read the
Yeah.
label.
Yeah. So I think the verdict is basically, or I guess the summary would be for any athlete to try it. If you're considering using caffeine, try it, observe how your body responds, but be aware of the potential risk and consume it mindfully, making sure that you do focus on your sleep and your nutrition and your hydration foremost, and then using caffeine as it truly is supposed to be as a supplement to a strong foundation. Kind of your thoughts on that?
I would sign this. Stamp and sign this.
Yay.
Thank you.
Yay.
Thank you, Jess.
You're welcome. So, as a sports pharmacist, it's our mission to provide you with accurate and evidence-based information to optimize your health and performance. So, remember when it comes to your health and well-being choices, consult with your physician or pharmacist, prioritize safety, and always make informed decisions.
Thanks for joining us today, and we look forward to sharing more valuable scientific and actionable insights in our next episodes.